It's about 20% of students now have a diagnosable case of anxiety. And so my approach to that is showing them how to interrupt a pattern and doing it consistently. And there's multiple ways of showing them that they have power over it.
You're listening to Stories from the Top, an inside guide to better business development. All right, we are back with Dennis Carroll one more time to talk about Premier NLP Life Coaching. And specifically right now, we're going to go about anxiety and how Dennis approaches it and kills it for people. Dennis, to start out, can you just kind of give us a quick recap of who you are as well as what is anxiety in your professional opinion?
Well, thank you again for having me back. The label I've been given, which I'm not thrilled about, is life coach. And the reason I'm kind of backing away from that is because there's no entry point, no barrier. And there are many, many people calling themselves life coach. So I'm really more of an NLP or neuro-linguistic programming practitioner. So I'm a licensed master practitioner under Dr. Richard Bandler, who's the co-creator and co-founder of NLP. And so I offer an 8-session program that focuses on anxiety and depression to get rid of that for people so they can live their lives happy and fulfilled. Because without intervention, typically those two things get worse over time, not better.
So tell us a little bit. We're going to talk about anxiety in this episode. What is anxiety? Can you just define it?
So my definition is probably going to be different than
that's what I want to hear your definition. Yeah.
Great. So anxiety is a pattern of behavior that meets a set of subconscious emotional needs. And there's 4 needs, there's 6 needs. 4 of them are primary needs. They're like air, food, water, and sleep, right? We have to meet them. So there's a need called certainty, uncertainty, significance, and love. Those are primary needs, and they have to get met. And believe it or not, anxiety can meet all 4 of them. Not always, but if it meets 3 of them, now you're meeting enough of your needs to go back to that pattern over and over. Because if you don't have a better way to get those needs met, you're going to go back to anxiety. They got to get met. So to me, it's just a pattern of behavior that people use or have learned to use to meet subconscious needs.
Yeah, and we see so much anxiety now. What's some of the ways you see it manifesting in culture right now?
Well, for the more extreme cases, the kids are calling out of school. They're being called home from school. They're really, especially in the high schools now, it's about 20% of students now have a diagnosable case of, quote unquote, of anxiety. So it's causing problems for kids at school, socially, on testing, right? Some kids have, quote unquote, testing anxiety or test anxiety. It's really just a matter of extreme worry, exacerbated, and chronic extreme worry. That's all anxiety is.
Do you think all the social media and a lot of it, since COVID, there's been a big shift where a lot of things are online. People have spent less time with people, and it's kind of, at least we've seen, where it's harder to get in a room with people. People have kind of shied away from in-person interactions and things like that. And for younger people, it's everything with dating now. There's nowhere to go out and meet people. It's all online. Do you think that's played into it?
I think social media is playing a huge role in it. And from this perspective, right, no one's really, well, at least most people aren't putting up their real life on social media, right? But people look at that and they think, oh, this person has it so much better than I do. Or I don't live up to that person, or I can't measure up to that person, and I'm not as good as that person, or my life, and so they're looking at it from a perspective of lack about themselves, and like they don't measure up, and so they start to get anxious about being accepted, right? And I think it does play a role that way, for sure.
And it's one of those things too, it kind of like, it creeps up on you. You don't choose to be an anxious person. It's something like a small thing, and then it kind of snowballs, and it feeds itself over time.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of your main missions is to cure anxiety for people. What is your approach to doing that?
So I want to be careful with the word cure because I don't really treat anybody. My approach to that is helping them to understand, first off, that they have power over it. So this may get some backlash, okay? because how politically correct we have to be anymore. But anxiety only happens when someone is in their feminine energy. Doesn't matter whether they're male or female. We're not talking about sexuality or sexual preferences at all. It has nothing to do with that. Feminine energy is driven by a need to connect, right? And feminine energy also takes small problems and blows them up, makes them big. Masculine energy takes big problems and makes them small. Says, don't worry about it. It's no big deal, right? Even when it is a big deal. So first off, I show people that. I show them how to shift their energy. When they see that by shifting their energy, they can immediately interrupt anxiety. They can see, oh, I have power over this. Because they, like you said, they're not choosing to be anxious. It creeps up to them. All of a sudden, they're feeling anxious, and they don't know how they got there. So they don't feel like I have power over it. So and there's multiple ways of showing them that they have power over it, and there's multiple ways to interrupt a pattern. And so my approach to that is showing them how to interrupt a pattern and doing it consistently. And then once they understand the pattern, and we do a deep dive into how they're creating the pattern. And that's called a strategy. It's in the subconscious. It's 7 to 9 things they do super, super fast, like that fast, right? And they say they don't know they're doing that. Once I can pull that out of them, and they see that, and they can give them a choice along that pattern or along that strategy to do something different. And then instead of leaving the strategy into anxiety, they can leave the strategy into inner peace or excitement or curiosity. So it's giving them choice, right? Then combine all that with guided meditation, also known as hypnosis, to show them what a waste of time, energy, and effort, and just not getting them where they want to get. And that really is powerful to move them away from it.
I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about the needs and how anxiety can meet some of those needs, like
Sure.
certainty, uncertainty. Can you
Yep.
unpack that and explain how that works?
I can try. It's a lot to unpack because I usually use a whiteboard and teach it visually. Okay, so when someone gets anxious, it's the same feeling over and over. It might be different levels of intensity, right? But it's the same feeling. So it's a certain feeling, right? So if I'm going to get anxious, I know what that feels like, especially if I've done it for any length of time. So even though it feels very uneasy, it's a certain feeling. So they get a sense of certainty from getting anxious. It's the same thing over and over and over. The second need I mentioned was uncertainty. It can also be called variety or stimulation. Now, anxiety is very stimulating, not in a good way, but it's still stimulating, right? The third need I mentioned is significance, right? When we look at a pattern, we look at the microcosm of the pattern. So I'm only looking at anxiety in that moment. So when someone's getting anxious, and I'll ask them, whatever you're thinking about in that moment that's causing this anxiety, how important are you making it in your mind? Then certainly they're making it important or they wouldn't get anxious over it. So it's meeting that sense of significance. So right there, you're meeting those top three needs, right? Fourth need is love, also known as connection. Now, someone might talk about the anxiety with someone and then are able to connect through that pattern. Other times they just keep it to themselves and they don't meet that last need. But as we said, if you meet 3 of those 4 needs and you don't have a better way to get your needs met, you're going to get anxious over and over or depressed or whatever it is. Does that help?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's weird how something very negative can fulfill some of those needs or make a space for connection between people.
Yeah, well, I did it for 31 years with depression. And depression actually meets all 4 of them. Okay, and it meets connection because with depression, you go inside. You connect to yourself through depression in a kinesthetic fashion. Not a deep level of connection, but it does meet it.
Yeah, so why do you think anxiety is so difficult for people to escape on their own? Like I have family members that are in their 60s that are super high anxiety, and they'll probably have it forever if they don't reach out to someone else. Why do you think it's something that is so difficult?
Well, unless there's some sort of intervention, it typically gets worse over time. I can only speak from my perspective because it's not probably going to be 100% of the people who hear this, but certainly 90+%. Your subconscious identity controls you. Okay, the strongest force in our experience as human beings is our need to remain consistent with who we see ourselves to be at the subconscious level. And so many people see themselves as being inadequate. Okay, so if your subconscious tells you that you are inadequate, that becomes your subconscious identity. Now, if it's the inadequacy that's driving the anxiety, how can you ever get rid of anxiety until you get over or change your subconscious identity from, the feelings of inadequacy? And that's what I think it is. And that's really, again, that's where I do the crux of my work, is changing people's beliefs at the subconscious level of who they are at their core. And when you change that belief, you don't have to go back to anxiety anymore. It's not going to send you. That's why I said, I give all these tips on social media, and they work. They're real actionable tips. But unless you change it in the subconscious, it's coming back.
Yeah, how do you penetrate into the subconscious and change it?
That's the hypnosis, right? Where I think we talked about this on the last show, where you identify the feelings where they live in your body, and you integrate the feelings of love and blend those two organic. They see deep, deep, deep in the subconscious, there's only pictures. Just below the surface, we have words, we have pictures, we have feelings. Deep in the subconscious, our subconscious has pictures, organic pictures of our feelings. So we identify the feeling of inadequacy and let your subconscious give that a shape and a color in your hand. We identify the pictures. I say feelings, they identify the picture, right? The feelings of inadequacy have a picture. You put the picture in your hand, and you combine that with a picture of love until they both look like the picture of love. And that literally changes the subconscious identity from being not worthy and not good enough, or whatever version of that you used to tell yourself, into feeling good about yourself. And that literally changes the subconscious identity, which may sound scary to people, but it's really not, because it's really who you are anyway. And we're really just chipping away who you're not.
Yeah. As a parent, do you have any tips for raising kids to kind of head that off? Even, I know you work with a lot of high schoolers, even at the very primary levels of whatever, a toddler up to a 10-year-old. Is there any tips or advice you have to instill the proper patterns of thinking at that age?
The kids I see are the smartest ones, right? They're always really, really smart kids that come to me, the high schoolers and college kids. But before you get that, and I'm not a biological parent, okay? So I'm talking conceptually, but from what I see, I observe people, and people who are anxious, aren't anxious. People with really good, solid foundations, right? I don't want to get too religious on you here, but people have some kind of deep belief. And then also that they know that they're loved and that they don't need to be perfect to be loved. So I knew my father loved me. He didn't have the ability to say it. And I don't hold that against him. He's long gone. He's on the other side now. I know he's still here with me. I believe that to my core. So he knows that I'm not saying this out of turn. I don't speak ill of the dead ever. But I never felt his love. And that caused me to feel more inadequate, right? I already felt inadequate, so I didn't tell. I see parents who just not overly love their children. I don't mean to be doting all over them. That's not what I'm talking about. Making sure that these kids know, I love you no matter what. And you have your flaws. I used to watch my wife yelling at my stepkids as she was putting a plate of food in front of them, right? And I did that, and I was like a marvel at the way she would discipline her kids. She's loving them while she's disciplining them. And both those kids are thriving today.
That's awesome.
What are some of the patterns of thinking that you think get young people into trouble with anxiety, or how do they enter into this, do you think?
I think there's two things they do. One is they'll look at themselves, their flaws, and this young girl came in the other day with her mom, she's a 15-year-old girl, cute as can be. And she starts laughing, trying to get these out. She knew she was saying something to herself. And she was calling herself, in her head, fat, ugly B word, I think it was. And she's laughing as she's saying it because she didn't want to admit that she was doing it. But she's criticizing herself, right? So she's making herself feel inadequate by looking at what's not perfect about herself, which I think is pretty common. People look at what's wrong with them instead of what's right with them. And then on top of that, they start asking what-if questions in their head. And that what-if might be, what if they don't like me? Or the other way they do is, I hear people say this, every time I meet someone new, I get anxious. So what's going to happen next time they meet someone new? They just told themselves. They just told their subconscious they're going to get anxious, right? So it's a lot of the language. What if they don't like me? What if I don't fit in? I had a lady, she got real anxious all the time. She said, I asked her how she knew it was time. When is it time to get anxious? She said, I don't know. It just happens to me. I said, I know that's how it feels, but you're doing this to yourself. And she said, well, I'm anxious as soon as I wake up. And I didn't really actually think that was true. So I said to her, are your eyes open or closed? And she said, closed. And then she said, oh, wait, no, my eyes are open. I said, okay, now I have something to work with. I said, what's the first thing you do? She said, I look at the clock. Okay, and what happens next? And then she said, well, then I'm anxious. I said, no, wait. We have to dive in, because she was doing this stuff so fast, she didn't realize she was doing it. So it turned out she would look at the clock. She would say to herself, I'm going to be late. That would create a feeling of fear in her gut. She would then picture herself stuck in traffic. She said, I'm never going to make it. Then she'd say to herself, and she's doing visualizations, talking to herself, feelings, and she would picture all her coworkers grimacing at her when she walked into the office. And I said, does that ever happen? And she said, no, they don't even look up. But she was making herself feel anxious before she even got to work, for only because she's meeting her subconscious needs with that, as we mentioned earlier, right? But that's the things people do to themselves, and they don't know they're doing it.
What about in like a business sense? What do you think that business owners are doing to create anxiety for themselves, and how can they stop?
Good question. I think some of them are looking at they're looking at their bank account, or looking at their their ledger, and they're looking at the money that's going out and looking at the money that's not coming in, and they're starting to worry, what if I can't pay my bills, or what if what if? Again, it's what if questions. Now there's a variation on that. I had a tree surgeon, a very successful guy, owned 3 homes, not rental properties, 3 different homes, one in the Poconos, one down in Maryland, and one right in Westchester here. And very successful guy, very anxious. And he used to say, what am I going to do if they leave me? Talking about his cruise. And I kept saying, what about the what if question? He said, no, I'm not saying what if. And then I heard him say, what am I going to do if they leave me? Well, take out, am I going to do? And that's still a what if question. Right? So he didn't realize he was doing it, but he was doing it. So it's looking at potential problems, asking yourself a what if question typically, and then run a movie to fulfill that what if question. What am I going to do if they leave me? So now he's picturing his trucks sitting on the side of the road. Nobody's operating them. Right? He's picturing that he doesn't have any workers. He's picturing the money's not coming in, and he's making himself anxious. And it's typically how people do it. They'll ask a what if question, fulfill that with a movie. They'll run the movie to the problem. They'll reset the movie, run the movie to the problem, reset the movie, and that's how they create the anxiety.
Yeah, there's some very successful business owners with a lot of anxiety. They almost use that to fuel themselves. You know what I mean? It's like their fear
sometimes it is a
driving.
catalyst to get people to do things. And when that is the case, there's a secondary benefit to the anxiety. So in my work, I have to make sure that I maintain that secondary
that's what I was gonna
benefit.
ask. Is anyone ever hesitant? Like,
Well,
I
yeah,
kinda need
yeah,
this anxiety.
yeah. If you don't maintain that secondary benefit of what they get out of the anxiety, they're going to keep the anxiety. So you have to find a way to maintain that. Yeah.
Do you have any example of what replacing a secondary benefit might look like?
Short answer, no, not at the top of my head. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
I'd have to take a long pause for that.
Yeah, so I'm curious to kind of add to that point. Is there positive things that, like, maybe the human body is trying to do something positive by forecasting potential problems and finding ways to fix them?
Absolutely.
How do
I
you
mean,
separate the difference between them?
Well, I mean, think about our evolution, right? When we were cavemen and cavewomen, we couldn't walk past the bush without looking for the saber-toothed tiger, right? So we evolved to look for, danger. It's inherent in our nature to want to avoid pain as a means to self-preservation. So people are looking for problems in order to solve them, right? In order to not have that problem. And I get that, right? And it can be useful, but when it becomes the only way you approach things, then the anxiety becomes more and more prevalent, right? There are other ways I'm more of a proactive guy. I want to take, like, what can I do to move myself forward today? Not like what's going to be the problem coming up at me. Like I'll often say, what has to happen in order to blank? That's a great question because it presupposes that something is there that you can solve. You put that out into the universe, right? I'll often just throw these questions out and not expect an answer right away, knowing that my subconscious will work on it. And, it'd be a random time where like all of a sudden this answer just pops into my head. So I'm always looking for solutions rather than problems. And that takes work, right? Because there's a part of your brain known as the reticular activating system. And that's a real part of your brain that's always looking for something to focus on. And with, the way social media is, the way the news is, the way, I don't have to go very far to find something negative if I want to find it. So I'm careful about what I filter into my brain, what I watch on television, what I read online. I'm careful not to watch these things that I feel over time will influence you negatively, right? Because it's going to get in there.
What's an example of things that would influence you negatively?
Well, years ago, when Howard Stern was on terrestrial radio and he was battling John DeBella, for the older people who know this story, he was really, really negative. And as funny as he was and popular as he was, I turned it off. I didn't turn it back on until years later when I got Sirius satellite radio, and Howard's mellowed dramatically. He's a completely different person than he was then, and I do listen fairly often now. I also often listen to Joel Osteen, who, when I first saw Joel, he used to drive me crazy because I heard he didn't have any formal training, and I heard this and that. And then I thought about it from a biblical perspective, and I thought, who does God use the most in the Bible? And so people are the least likely to be that, right? And so Joel has a very, very positive message, and his is always like, look at your best is out in front of you. Be positive. Think about positive things. Think about what's good. Think about what you're grateful for. Think about what you appreciate, and all those things are, we have the opportunity to focus on what's good in our life, or focus what's bad in our life, and your focus is going to really create the quality of your life. I'm not sure I answered your question. I think I went off with that.
No, that's okay. That's perfect. And kind of the last question I had was, how does depression kind of fit into the role of anxiety, and what's like the big differentiator between the two?
So
they often get lumped together.
They
Depression
do.
or anxiety.
So what happens a lot of times is people who get anxious, that anxiety prevents them from doing certain things that they want to do, and then they'll get depressed about that because they're not living their life and they're not having that connection. Now, there's other people who just get depressed and don't get anxious. That was me. I never had issues with anxiety. It literally wasn't on my radar. In fact, I didn't even know how bad it was until I got anxious one time with my wife, and literally driving up from Key West to the middle of the Keys, and she's holding her phone out the window taking pictures. And I kept, getting very upset with her. Get the phone back in, get the phone back in. And she said, why? I said, I can't help it. This isn't logical. That was the first time I ever had anxiety. And so I really got the experience of what it was for people. But prior to that, I never had a realization. I was glad I had the experience so I could be more empathetic to the people that I'm working with. And I didn't understand it until then. So there are people who just get depressed and they just feel inadequate. Those people tend to get angry too. They'll go from depression to anger. But they may internalize it, so you might not ever see it. Anxiety, the patterns I see, right, is be anxiety to depression, and then back to anxiety and back to depression. Person who's depressed without the anxiety, you'll see anger to depression and back and forth, or depression to anger, depending on their gender.
Very interesting. Well, once again, Dennis, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been amazing. It's been relaxing just having your energy in here. So
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks
so much.
Thank you, guys.
Stories from the Top is your guide to successful business development. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or find Edge of Cinema on YouTube. Stories from the Top is an Edge of Cinema production, hosted by Matthew Skura and Jeremy Schmidt. To learn more or get in touch, visit edgeofcinema.com/podcast.